Hello everyone, my name is Matthew Grzeszczuk and this is a podcast about the world and international relations for those who want to know more. Dear listeners, good morning to the second international episode for you from the USA, Yoshiko Herrera, Professor of Political Science, University of Wisconsin Madison. Great honor and pleasure. Good afternoon, Professor.
Thank you.
Professor, a lot of time has passed since February. What, in your opinion, is the actual goal of Vladimir Putin today, the purpose of this war?
Well, I think that we can see from the behavior of Russia that the purpose is, number one, to deny the sovereignty of Ukraine as a state, to not allow Ukraine to exist as an independent state. That's number one. Number two, I think we have to acknowledge that there is also a punishment strategy, that the atrocities and war crimes are not meant just for any strategic goal, but actually as a kind of cruel punishment of the Ukrainian people. So I think that you can somewhat understand a sort of military state goal of denying sovereignty to Ukraine, but I think the other side of it is punishment. And that goes along, I think, also with denial of Ukrainian nationhood.
Have these goals changed from February?
Well, the justifications given by Vladimir Putin have changed a lot. People remember before the war, this was just military exercises. They even said they were finished with them and they were going home. Second, there was discussion of, before the war, of the threat of NATO expansion, etc., things like that. But then on February 21st, the first step was the recognition of People's Republic of Donetsk and Luhansk, and the claim was that there was genocide against Russians. Okay, that seems to have been abandoned pretty quickly. The next thing was about stopping a NATO attack that was coming through Ukraine. Then there was the fascism and other just ludicrous claims about the Ukrainian government. So there was a range of justifications given, but I think that in addition to the stated things from the Russian government, we can see from their actions that this denial of sovereignty and punishment, I think, of Ukrainian nation is the goal.
In Poland, I often heard that it's problem with Putin advisors. Putin has bad information about the real situation in Ukraine.
Well, okay, it seems Putin is isolated. I think there's a lot of evidence that he's not actually getting a lot of external information. But I think that there's a lot of options to him. He is no way constrained in the sense of making these choices. That is, the choices for aggression. This was clearly a choice of Russian government and of Putin. But is he getting bad advice? Well, I don't know. This is a good question of why did the Russians think that they could be victorious? It seems clear that they thought they would be able to take over control of all of Ukraine in a few days. To me, okay, let's just be clear on the record. I did not predict the invasion because I thought, number one, they would lose, that they would face Ukrainian resistance, insurgency, even from the start, and also that it would destroy Russia, which I think both of those things have in some ways come to pass. And I think that it's that from that perspective, I have debated with other people, like, is this rational or not rational, or why are they doing this? What information do they have? I think, to me, one of the issues is that they didn't foresee the Ukrainian resistance, and maybe a lot of other Western commentators didn't as well. But why? I think they just were ignoring the information that was available publicly. I mean, these public opinion polls and, how much does it take to understand that Ukrainians would resist a Russian invasion? I think this is just pretty obvious from any small number of conversations with Ukrainians. So I don't know if this is a matter of advisors or a matter of willfully ignoring the situation in Ukraine because they just didn't respect Ukraine enough to learn about what's the actual situation in Ukraine, especially since 2014.
Professor, do we know anything about the reaction of the political elite in the Kremlin, the real reaction to what is happening at the front? I'm also asking about the moods in Moscow.
Well, okay, this is a matter of a lot of speculation. So I'll just say my opinion, but with the caveat that actually the Kremlin seems more closed off than in the past. That's, what people who study kind of Kremlin politics claim that they have much less access than they had in the past. Okay, so I don't see how the mood cannot be kind of dark, because unless they are believing their own propaganda, they have to. I mean, number one, they know that they didn't win in 3 days like they assumed. That's number one. Number two, even though they deny things like these atrocities and war crimes, things like the sinking of the flagship Moskva, how can you explain this? Either your own incompetence allowed the ship to sink, or the Ukrainians sank it. So there's some things that I think, how can you see that as anything but a negative? The length of the war so far, it's also negative. The Russian government's trying to present everything going fine, and this is a temporary situation with the economy and everything will go back to normal. That is their propaganda. But I think that they know things are not going to go back to normal. And even though they have done, I have to admit, like central bank has actually managed the crisis better than expected, I think that if they're honest, they have to understand that the war is not going well. So to what extent does Vladimir Putin appreciate this? I don't know. I think maybe he is really separate from reality and isn't accepting the situation. But there is a lot of evidence that the war is not going well for Russia.
Changing Putin to someone else, reality of media slogans?
I think the Putin regime, I think it's important for people to understand, it has changed over time in certain ways. For example, there is more use of violence to maintain power, especially since 2012, than there was in the let's say, first 10-ish years of the Putin regime. But in some other ways, the regime remains similar in cruel punishment of enemies. That has happened from almost the start of his regime, and willingness to commit atrocities. You can see that in the Second Chechen War. So there's certain things that stay the same, but in other ways, the regime knows that they are facing a legitimacy crisis, that they lack, let's say, stable support among the population, and they know they have to increasingly use violence to maintain power.
In the USA, there are slogans about the collapse of Russia?
Not really. I mean, I think it's reasonable to ask if Russia, or let's say when Russia loses the war, how will the Putin regime maintain power? For example, if Ukraine were to push Russia all the way out of Crimea, I think this is very hard to explain to the population in Russia, the loss of Crimea after the regime made such a big deal of it following 2014. So I think it would cause further legitimacy questions for Putin regime if they lose the war. So I think it's reasonable to, wonder how they can survive. On the other hand, I don't think the concept of regime change, like in Syria that was sought, or Iraq, Afghanistan, I don't think people are taking this seriously as a goal for the US or for NATO.
In Poland, we probably like only talking about it. Final case, Joe Biden in the Middle East, is change the geopolitical situation?
Well, I think there's some really interesting things going on. Okay, number one, Turkey is really important in the war. Why? Because they're controlling the Black Sea. Okay, so the Black Sea, it's important in the war. Turkey's role so far is in NATO. It's supporting the sanctions. So, that's one thing. On the other hand, Russia, now there's reports that they're getting drones from Iran. That's another sign to me, has to be humiliating to Russia. They can't produce their own drones. They're getting them from Iran. Okay. So this seems strange. But Turkey and Iran were on the opposite sides of the Syrian civil war, with Turkey against Assad, Iran and Russia supporting Assad. So it's a little bit strange, and I don't know what would come of it if Turkey and Iran decide to work together. And then Biden is in, that's the part about Putin, Iran, Turkey. On the other side of Middle East, Biden in Israel, Israel is very concerned about Iran, so concerned that they are also working now with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states to counter Iranian threat. Okay. Netanyahu government had been very much supporting Putin and Trump. So what does it mean what does this mean for Israel if they're working against Iran? What does it mean for Israeli relations with Russia. Israel has been lukewarm on supporting Ukraine. So I think this is kind of an important moment, and I would expect the Biden administration to be talking to Israel about further support for Ukraine. That would go, if Israel moves towards Ukraine, the US, this would be against Russia, against Iran. That this kind of makes sense. But Turkey in the mix there, it's complicating. So I think actually this Middle East politics right now and the positions on Syria, on Iran, there's a lot of possibilities there.
Yeah, great geopolitical puzzle. Professor, thank you very much for the conversation, time and knowledge. Yoshiko Herrera, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Raport z Ukrainy i rozmowy o Ukrainie na podróży bez paszportu.